We find ourselves at our most vulnerable. Our first instinct is often to call the police, those who have taken an oath to serve and protect. But as in any profession, there are those few bad apples who manage to hide behind the very badge meant to symbolize trust and safety. Today, we delve into a chilling case where one of those bad apples shattered the lives of an entire family. It was an armed robbery called in from a family-owned restaurant. The assailant stole $10,000, brutally shot and killed 2 of the 4 children working there, and murdered a police officer who was working extra duty at the scene. But the horror did not end there. The first officer who responded to the call did not come to investigate. She came to finish what she started. Antoinette Frank, a New Orleans police officer, used her badge to kill. Her actions left an indelible scar on a grieving family, a scar that remains decades later. Frank is now the only woman sitting on death row in Louisiana. But Frank's story doesn't end there. After her arrest, a new tenant moved into her now former residence and discovered a skeleton buried beneath the house, a grim reminder of the darkness she left behind. Chuck Hustmyre joins us today. He's a retired police officer who felt compelled to turn Antoinette Frank's crime into a book, Killer with a Badge. I'm Kiran Chawla, and this is Louisiana Unfiltered. Welcome back, everyone. For this episode, we are joined by Chuck Hustmyre. Chuck, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I want to jump right in. Give us a little bit of your history. You did work at the sheriff's office, so you have a law enforcement background, correct?
Yes. I spent 22 years in law enforcement. I started with the sheriff's office here. Then I was hired by the district attorney's office as an investigator. And then I was hired by ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, as a special agent, and they transferred me to New Orleans. So I spent the rest of my career in New Orleans working violent crime, drug cases, that type of thing.
Okay.
And on a variety of task forces, Marshall's Task Force, some other stuff. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in law enforcement. I was pretty badly injured in an accident, and they put me out on a medical retirement. So I had to do something. I was fairly young. I was in my 40s, and so I started writing.
And that book is Killer with a Badge. I'm going to get to that in just a second. For our listeners, when he's saying that he was with the sheriff's office here, that's in Baton Rouge. So New Orleans and Baton Rouge are about a 90-ish minute drive, depending on how fast you drive or where you're going in New Orleans. But anywhere between an hour, hour and a half drive away. And the crime that we're talking about happened in New Orleans, involved a New Orleans police officer, and it happened in 1995. So fast forward 29 years, and Antoinette Frank is the only woman on death row in Louisiana. Correct, Chuck?
That is correct. I don't think they've executed a woman in Louisiana since the 1940s, and she's been on death row for almost 30 years.
And in fact, I was reading up that she was supposed to be executed in 2008.
Yeah, they've had several dates, proposed dates, but she always somehow beats it on an appeal or whatever. I mean, I don't know all the legal machinations that go on death row, but, I doubt it'll ever happen, actually.
So first off, let's start with filling in our viewers. I know right when you sat down, you're like, I don't know why there's interest in something that happened more than that, nearly 30 years ago. Because unfortunately, it just feels like Louisiana has some of the most heinous crimes. And let's be honest, NOPD has had a black eye, and maybe it's safe to say that, yeah, NOPD still does have a bad black eye.
Yeah, I worked with a lot of New Orleans police officers for several years. I was on a violent crime task force with NOPD, and a lot of them are good cops, but as an institution, it is a very corrupt department. You know, something like you would expect Chicago PD or NYPD to be. It's just in the South, and they have a lot of problems, and they've had them for decades and decades, and that indirectly, that institutional sort of corruption and incompetence indirectly led to the events in this book and the Antoinette Frank and case and the murders and all that. So, yeah, and she's not the first police officer in New Orleans to be convicted of murder.
No.
There are others.
Yes.
Two of them I can think of off the top of my head convicted of murder. So, yeah, it's quite a problem down there. It always has been, and frankly, it'll never get fixed.
So set the scene for me. Take me back to 1995. Take me back to that scene.
Okay, so Antoinette Frank was a police officer. She was fairly new on the NOPD, and she bounced around with several partners because she was very, I've talked to her supervisors and people who rode with her, and they said, oddly, given what happened later, she was very timid. One officer described her as sort of mousy, and she and some other officers worked an off-duty security detail, which in New Orleans at the time, like a lot of cities, police officers work in uniform, but they're paid by the company to do whatever company they're providing security for. They're paid directly by that company. And she and another officer, Ronald Williams, sort of swapped out. They were on the same shift at the 7th District Police Station in New Orleans, and they swapped doing this security detail for this restaurant, the Kiran restaurant, which was a Vietnamese restaurant in a part of New Orleans called New Orleans East. It's far on the eastern edge of the city, near a giant swamp. And
it connects to Lake Pontchartrain. New Orleans East will connect you to Lake Pontchartrain and then go right over that to Slidell.
Correct. It's the very eastern edge of the city, and there's a high Vietnamese population there, and this was a popular Vietnamese restaurant. And Antoinette Frank was mad at Ronald Williams over that detail. She didn't think she was getting enough hours. Now, we can go back further of how she got hired by the police department in the first place, that she went through a lot of stuff to get on. She shouldn't have been hired. There were tons of red flags, and they just kept on letting her progress through the system until she was hired. But that's like another story, really. So one night, she has this guy she's hanging out with, Rogers Lacaze. He was a 18-year-old gangster wannabe from New Orleans East. He was a crack dealer. They met. He was shot in a drug deal. He was in the hospital. Somehow Antoinette Frank was assigned to go to the hospital and take his statement. They became, believe it or not, they became friends after that. She rented him a car. She bought him a cell phone. And this is in an era where not everybody had cell phones. This is 1995. And she bought him clothes. And so they were hanging around when she was off duty. Sometimes she would drive around in a police car with him.
And it's believed that they had a romantic relationship?
Yeah, according to him. I got in touch with him when I was writing the book, and he said that, they had been involved in a romantic relationship briefly. And although he told me she was really crazy. The dad part will come in later, but just a funny quote that I put in the book that I thought from him was, he said, "Hell, she's so crazy she killed her own dad."
Oh,
so
wow. Even
by Rogers Lacaze's standards, Antoinette was kind of crazy. So she and Rogers, on the night that this happened, she and Rogers went to the Kiran restaurant. Ronnie Williams was in uniform. He's a New Orleans police officer. He was working the security detail at the front of the restaurant. They said hello to him. They went in. They got some free food. They bummed off of the owners. Now, let me back up a second. The owners of the Kiran restaurant, they really liked Antoinette. They bought her a birthday present. They gave her like Christmas gifts. They really took care of her. One of the survivors of this shooting told me that they kind of looked at her as like a family member almost. And so she went to the restaurant with Rogers. They checked it out. They got some food. They left. They came back again. They said they were going to a midnight movie. And Chow Vu, who was the daughter of the owners and who survived the shooting, told me that she got a weird feeling over this Rogers Lacasse guy. They didn't understand who he was, why he was with her, or why he was at the restaurant acting strange, she said. So they eventually left after the second visit. Well, what they were doing is casing the joint to see how many customers were there and make sure that Ronnie Williams was there and where he was in the restaurant. They went back a third time as the restaurant, well, just after it had closed. No one's really sure how they got in because Chow Vu said she locked the door, and there's a she left the keys in the lock on the inside, and there's a pretty strong possibility that Antoinette Frank took the keys out of the lock on that second visit and left. So she had a key. So they locked it, the door. She had a key. She came in. She and Rogers Lacasse came in the restaurant. Rogers Lacasse, from the forensic evidence at the scene and from what the lead detective, Eddie Rance, told me about his investigation, Rogers shot Ronnie Williams in the back of the head. That was the first thing they did. They walked in. Ronnie Williams saw him. He wouldn't have been on alert, of course, because she's another cop, and they worked the same shift out of the 7th District Station. So he had his back to the door, probably looking and talking to Antoinette about, something along the lines of, hey, what are you doing here again? And Rogers Lacasse came in the door and shot him in the back of the head. Antoinette Frank took the 4 family members who worked at the restaurant, pushed them into the kitchen. 2 of them hid in a cooler. The restaurant also had a convenience store attached to it, and so the glass coolers that you get soft drinks and beer out of, behind that area is a big refrigerated space, so you can load the shelves. Well, 2 of the family members hid inside that space. Antoinette Frank shot and killed their brother and sister. They were down on their knees. Antoinette put them on their knees in the kitchen and shot them in the head. They took the money that they could find, which Chow Vu said she put money in the microwave oven. When she saw them coming the third time, she got nervous, and she grabbed all the money they were counting, which a Vietnamese community like that, they operate a lot on cash, especially in the 90s. No one's really using credit cards back then in a Vietnamese neighborhood. They paid cash for everything. So she had around $10,000, and she shoved it into a microwave oven. And somehow Antoinette found out, probably the other 2 told her where the money was. Then she shot him in the head, and she got the money. They took off. They looked around for the 2. They knew there were 2 people missing.
Didn't one of them plea for their life?
Yeah, the 2 that she murdered, the sister Chow. You could hear them. They were right on the other side of a door. They could hear them. So yeah, they were of course begging for their lives. The brother and sister who were killed, and of course Antoinette shot them in the head multiple times with a Beretta 9mm, which was the duty weapon at the time of the New Orleans Police Department. How she got that weapon is kind of a strange story. She got it out of the property room, the evidence room. She faked a court order to get that gun. She forged a judge's signature, a district judge, to get that gun out of the property and evidence room, and that's the one that she used. Everyone was killed with that gun. So It went from Rogers's hands when he killed Ronnie Williams to Antoinette's hands when she killed the other 2. I don't know why that happened. They must have had a second gun with them. She's not talking, and neither one of them has told the truth about the story. During the subsequent investigation, Antoinette Frank gave like 3 different versions that night on video, and I've seen all the video recordings of the interviews. She gave 3 completely different versions of what happened. Each one was a little more, inculpatory for her. First she said she had nothing to do with it, and she's painted herself as a hero. She said she rescued the 2 people who survived by pushing them out the back door and making them get away from the restaurant as a bunch of men in masks came in and shot the place up. Then later she said, well, okay, she did go in there with Rogers, but she had no idea what he was going to do. She was just standing around doing nothing when he pulled a gun and started shooting people and robbing the restaurant. And on the third videotape statement, she said that she did, in fact, shoot the two who were killed on the kitchen floor, but Rogers had a gun to her head the whole time and forced her to do it. Now, of course, you might ask, why would a trained police officer not simply just turn the gun on Rogers and shoot him in the head? But, she never answered that question. So after the robbery, Antoinette dropped Rogers off his girlfriend's house, probably. Then she went to the 7th District Police Station. Now, she had a radio with her, police radio. They use a portable radio system in New Orleans. Every police officer is issued a pistol and a radio. And, it's with you all the time. You take it home, you take it to work. So she had a radio. So she heard a call come out at the Kim On restaurant of a shooting and a possible robbery. So she went to the 7th District Police Station. Don't really know why she did this, but, you got to figure she was probably in panic mode at this point. She went to the station, took a police car, and drove back to the scene. And she's still in plain clothes, but she drives a police car back to the scene, and she actually got there ahead of the responding units. So she was the first person back on the scene. She backed the car up to an insurance business that was nearby in the same kind of strip mall area. And she went to look for the two survivors. She knew there was two more, and she went into the restaurant to look for them. Responding units arrived. It was two detectives that were also working a security detail at the time out in that area, because you really couldn't live on a New Orleans Police Department salary unless you worked a lot of security details. So these two detectives show up, and they pulled up to the front of the building. One of them went around to the back, and the one who was headed to the front door, he saw the door burst open, and a young Vietnamese woman ran out of the restaurant, and that was Chow Vu. And right behind her is an African-American woman who he doesn't recognize in plain clothes. And so he pulls a gun on her and tells her to stop, and she identifies herself as a police officer. So he's thinking, and I talked to this detective, and he was thinking, okay, this is great. We have a police officer already in the scene, probably knows a lot more about what happened. So he asked her, hey, where's the cop who was on duty here, who was working a detail? And she says he's inside, he's been shot. So they call more people, more cops show up, ambulance shows up. It's processed like a normal, homicide scene. It's a triple murder with a police officer involved. The homicide division comes out. Eddie Rance was a sergeant, and he was in charge of the investigation. And he too thought, well, we have a police officer who witnessed this, so this should go up pretty quick. We'll find out what happened. Well, Antoinette started telling him the story about just mysterious guys in ski masks coming in while she was there. She rescued everybody and was a big hero. And he immediately realized that does not sound right. He was trying to ask the Vietnamese woman about it, but she would, even though she speaks English, she wouldn't speak English. She was, too upset, and she was just speaking Vietnamese. So they had to get a Vietnamese interpreter, which there's only one at that time in the New Orleans Police Department. And that took, he's at home. So it took a while, took an hour or two. He gets out to the scene, and this whole time, they're still thinking Antoinette Frank is a witness. And finally, the Vietnamese officer gets out, asks Chow Vu what happened, and she says Antoinette did it. Antoinette shot her brother and sister, and either her or the guy she was with shot the police officer in the front room, in the dining room. And so they can't believe this happened. I mean, Eddie Rance told me, he was just floored by this piece of information. But the crime scene sort of backed that up. And it's not like that this woman has a reason to lie. It's her brother and sister who are dead. So the chief came out, the new chief, and Eddie Rance told me, it's a quote in the book, probably can't say it on a podcast, but he went to the chief and he said, Chief, I'm going to book this MFer for 3 counts of first-degree murder. And the chief realizes, well, that's another police officer, but okay, go ahead. So they did. They booked her. They interviewed Antoinette. They asked, okay, well, who's the guy? Who's the guy with you? And I think she said it might have been her brother at first, but Roger Lacaze is like 5'2", Antoinette Frank's brother, who's also another scumbag criminal, he's like 6'6". So there's no, and it turned out later that the people in the restaurant knew her brother because he was hanging around the restaurant weeks earlier, bumming free food off of them, and he made Chow Vu nervous, and she asked Ronnie Williams to put him out of the restaurant and tell him not to come back. So Ronnie Williams, before all this happened, of course, Ronnie Williams went to Antoinette and said, hey, your brother is hanging around the restaurant, bumming free food. He doesn't work there. Get him out. Tell him not to go back. And that really pissed off Antoinette from what everyone said, and that's part of the kind of complex, weird motivation that Antoinette had for robbing that restaurant and taking out some vengeance on Ronnie Williams. So, I mean, if you want to keep going through the investigative part, Antoinette told the detectives who she was with. Eventually, there was a guy named Rogers Lacaze. You know, they ran him. They see he's got some minor criminal record. They found him. It was kind of he was hiding out he had left his girlfriend's house or his, baby mama's house, and he went to his brother's house on the West Bank of New Orleans, and they found him hiding in a apartment that his brother was renting. And they arrested him, brought him back for questioning, and basically Antoinette and Rogers both pointed fingers at each other saying, well, yeah, I was there, but there's the other person who did it. And they booked them both for first-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree murder. And they were tried separately, and eventually both were convicted. Well, no, I say eventually. Actually, it wasn't that long. It was like, I don't know, it was a couple months later they were both convicted. I think the murders happened in March of that year of 1995, and they were found guilty in July of 1995.
Has Roger ever spoken? Even during trial, has he ever?
He said that Antoinette was the brains behind it, which is probably true because having communicated with Roger several times, he really couldn't be the brains behind anything. I mean, one of his defenses to get away from it, and he's been his sentence. I forget it's not commuted, but anyway, he's no longer on death row. I forget the legal term. He was sentenced to death, and several years ago, his sentence was changed to life in prison. And one of his chief arguments, or at least the arguments of his pro bono attorneys, is that his IQ is not high enough to execute. So he's. They also argued that he was 17 at the time, which I don't know how they did that because the math is pretty simple. He was actually 18 at the time, but that they lost on that appeal. But they did eventually get some judge to change his sentence to life in prison, so he's no longer on death row. But yeah, he is not. He's not the brightest bulb in the
With the holdup on death row, I mean, honestly, between death row or life in prison, I feel like they really mean the exact same thing.
They pretty much do. I mean, Antoinette's been on death row for 30 years. 30 years this next year. And I mean, if it was me, I'd rather be on death row than life because death row inmates get their own cell. You don't have to worry. You can sleep at night. You don't have to worry about getting stabbed or having your throat cut. But I guess Rogers is back in general population. Although for all I know, he's probably a hero at Angola since he killed a police officer. That's something that they probably admire.
But other than that, he's never opened up about that night.
Other than to say he was there and that she did all the shooting and he didn't have anything to do with it. I don't know how much of that's true. I'm based on everything I know about the case, which is a decent amount. Antoinette she knew the restaurant, she knew the family, she knew they had money there. She knew everything. I mean, I think she kind of brought him into it, and I'm sure he was an eager participant. There are a lot of interactions with weird things that happened with Antoinette and Rogers before this happened. She took him on calls. I mean, he rode around with her while she was on duty in a police car, and she was in uniform. And Rogers does not look like, she tried to pass him off as a cadet, a police cadet. And Rogers looks exactly like what he is, a 1990s era gangster from New Orleans East. I mean, all of his teeth were gold. You know, he wore giant gold chains that probably weighed more than him. And I forget the brand everybody wore, all the criminals wore back then. Fubu, something like that. Those kind of clothes, jerseys. And she went to a call. You know, some guy called the police. Somebody was harassing his daughter, and he called the police. And when the police car finally got out there, it was Antoinette and Rogers. And I talked to the guy, and he's like, "Well, that was weird," And Antoinette said, "Oh, this is my trainee." And the guy said he later called Internal Affairs and said, "There's no way this guy was a police trainee, even in the New Orleans Police Department. That wouldn't work." She also was riding around with him in a car, and she was handling a wreck, just a traffic accident. And she needed her police. She was out directing traffic, and she needed her police car moved, and she had Rogers move it. And a detective I talked to saw that, and he's like, "What the heck is going on with this? I mean, who's this gangster jumping in a New Orleans police car and moving it? I mean, it doesn't make any sense." But that's one of the countless things that happened before the murders that, had it been addressed, the 3 people who were killed at the Kim-On restaurant would still be alive. I mean, you can go all the way back to her application process. I mean, she standard psychological tests that they give every recruit, every candidate, or every applicant. She failed. MMPI is what they used to give. She failed it. They had a procedure in place. If you failed it, you could talk to a psychologist at New Orleans Police Department. Well, she failed that interview. Then they had another thing where you could go to a psychiatrist, an MD. So she talked to a medical doctor who was a psychiatrist, and I interviewed him when I was writing the book. And he wrote, plain as day, she is not fit to be a police officer. That was his evaluation. He was hired by the New Orleans Police Department, and he turned that into them. She's not fit to be a police officer. They didn't care.
She still got hired
Still got hired. I mean,
and she had just been hired recently.
Yeah, she had only been working there, where she went to the academy, which back then was 4 months. I think she was in her second year. One of the district commander, who's a captain, and her boss, it's like a precinct. In New Orleans, they call it a district. And the district commander wanted to send her back to the academy because she was so inept at her job. But there's no procedure for sending someone back, even today. If you pass the academy but your boss thinks you're an idiot, they can't send you back to the academy. There's just no procedure. The procedure is to fire you, because every cop is hired on a probational basis for a year or so to make sure that they work out, but they wouldn't get rid of her.
So how did you get involved in all of this?
In 2004, I left my job at ATF. I got a medical retirement because of I broke my neck and my back and some other bones in an accident coming back from SWAT training. And I went back to work for several years, but I got a lot of arthritis in my joints and back and all in my neck. So they were going to put me on a desk job. So I said, well, I'm going to apply for the medical retirement. And they granted it. And so I was out, I was 40-something years old, retired from police work. And I always was interested in writing. So I knew a lot about crime. I knew a lot about New Orleans. So I was looking around for some interesting story to write about. And I was an ATF agent in New Orleans in '95 when this happened. And this murder and the arrest of a police officer was international news. I mean, they had journalists from all over the world coming to New Orleans. So I remembered the case. And, it had been about 9 years since it happened. And I decided I was going to write an article about it. So I reached out to, I can't remember who, New Orleans Magazine, maybe something like that. And I pitched an article to them. And I was new to writing nonfiction. And I researched it for the article, but I way over-researched it. I spent like a week going through files in some lawyer's office. I didn't know what I was doing. I went so far overboard in researching that the article came out. The article was good, but it was like 3,000 words, and I had so much research that I couldn't put in the article. So I decided I'm going to learn how to write a nonfiction book. So I went to, Barnes & Noble, and I bought a book on how to write nonfiction books. And, so I just started doing more research, and, it's a long process, but, I managed to get an agent in New York, a literary agent, interested in the pitch for the book, and then he managed to sell it to Penguin. And, nonfiction you sell first. They give you an advance to cover, because it costs a lot of money and time to research a nonfiction book. So I got a small advance, and that helped me out. And then I researched it, tried to get in touch with Antoinette Frank. That didn't work, but I did get in touch with Rogers Lacaze. I got in touch with all the cops. I mean, there's a whole lot of weird, I couldn't get the district attorney, the prosecutor, Glenn Woods. He prosecuted the case. He had left the DA's office, but he was brought back just for this case as a special prosecutor. So I knew that Glenn Woods hung out at Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop in New Orleans on Bourbon Street, 900 block of Bourbon. It's a really funky old bar. It's been there for over 200 years. Yep. One of the few places that survived the fire that wiped out most of the French Quarter. So anyway, I knew he hung out there, but I didn't know what he looked like. So I went in and I asked the bartender, I said, "Hey, I'm looking for a guy named Glenn Woods." And she just eyed me for a while. She didn't say anything. And then after a while, she pointed past me, beyond me, and said, "He's over there, the guy in the hat." So I went over and I saw a guy in a Panama, this black dude sitting there, and he had this cool Panama hat on, and he like a flowered shirt, like a Hawaiian shirt. He looked like, I don't know, kind of a Magnum PI kind of guy. And so I went over and introduced myself, and just started talking to him, started buying him drinks, which was key. And he told me briefly the story, and then I said, "Well, can you get me in touch with Eddie Rance, the lead detective?" And he said, "Well, maybe, we'll see." So anyway, long story short, we all met back again at Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop, and I brought a recorder, and I interviewed them both, and got it took a couple hours and, a couple $100 worth of bar tab, and I got the whole story from both of them, from there, because it's great. It's like an episode of Law and Order or something. I mean, the first half is the investigation part, and then the second half is the prosecution part. So I lucked out in that respect. And I couldn't get, the police department was not cooperative at all. Eddie Rance was retired, so he could talk. The police department actually put out a memo that said, "Hey, no cop can talk to this guy," meaning me. Even though a lot of the cops knew me because I'd just been working there in New Orleans on a NOPD task force. But they wouldn't talk. They said they lost the records. They couldn't find any records of the case. It's just typical stonewalling from NOPD. And a friend of mine who's a lawyer said, "Well, Supreme Court of Louisiana has a copy of the entire file, all the evidence, everything." So I went there, and through some kind of shenanigans I'm not going to get into, I managed to get the whole file in my possession. And I put it in my car, and I hauled ass back to Baton Rouge. And I copied the file at my lawyer friend's office. I burned out his copier, and I had to replace whatever the thing is that makes it go. But I got all the documents and had copies of them, and then we returned the file to the Supreme Court. And anyway, so then
So you had everything in your hands right there.
Yep.
Now let me ask you this. So 2004 is when you kind of get this idea. When was the book published?
I guess it was 2003 when I first started thinking about it, because I left in October of 2003. So the book was published in 2005. Okay. I did most of my research and the writing of the book in 2004, and the book came out, I believe, in 2005.
So the name of the book is Killer with a Badge. And so it's been out 19 years.
Yeah.
Would you say it's been a top seller?
It was a bestseller for Penguin at the time. It's long out of print, and I got the rights reverted back to me, and I publish it through an online service that publishes out-of-print books. So it is available in ebook and paperback. Not this exact paperback. It's the bigger one, the trade paper. But, it's of my 7 books that I have gotten all the rights back to, and I publish them through that service, Drafted Digital. They're available on everything like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, that kind of thing. But it's all, every month, it's the bestseller of my 7 books by far.
Well, good. So let's pick back up. I want to talk about first, number one, there was something very critical that I feel like one of the detectives, Eddie, the homicide detective, said about Antoinette.
Yeah, Eddie Rance, he interviewed her 3 times the night of the murders. And Eddie Rance is a very colorful character. I mean, he's been in, I think, 13 shootings on the job. He's homicide detective for years, investigated all kinds of horrendous murders. And he told me, he said, Antoinette Frank is the most cold-blooded person I've ever talked to, which I think is saying quite a lot because Eddie's seen a lot. And she is just a cold-blooded psychopath. I mean, I don't think she feels remorse for any of this.
Did he explain the why behind that statement?
Well, after the 3rd interview, at the end of the interview, she asked him, and these are recorded, she asked him kind of casually, like, okay, now I've told you what really happened. Am I going to lose my job over this? And that's what she asked him. I mean, so after admitting to 2 murders herself, shooting 2 totally innocent young, kids, basically, in their teens to death on the floor of their family restaurant, and being certainly an accessory to the murder of another police officer, her last question, you wrap up an interview, you're like, hey, you got anything else, anything you want to ask me? And that's what she asked. Am I going to lose my job over this?
Well.
Yeah, she really thought, okay, it's good. We're good. I'll be back on patrol tomorrow. I mean, she's a nut. I mean, I don't know what her grip on reality is, but it ain't very tight.
Now, she did not speak to you at all, right?
No. I sent her a couple letters like I did with Rogers, and I talked to people, who knew her, cops who knew her, and it's just so weird, the picture that came out of her is like she is timid as can be as a police officer, and nobody really wanted to work with her. I talked to one guy who rode with her. He was her current partner at the time of the shooting, and he got stuck with her. And he told me flat out. In fact, he wouldn't let me use his real name in the book. I note it, but there's a pseudonym that he wanted me to use. But he's like, I don't want to ride with her. And the boss, the captain, said, well, it doesn't matter. Nobody else does either, and you're going to ride with her. So that's what happened. And he said she was just worthless as a police officer because she was so timid. And so it's hard to, juxtapose that with being a brutal killer. Going in and murdering people who you personally know and who like you and hired you and all that gave you presents and just to kill them.
But you also did a deep dive into her younger life.
Yeah, I did.
Do you feel that really helped play a part in who she became as an adult?
Well, all I know about her, the source of her younger life and her dad abusing her and all is from her. I mean, that's things she told other people, and I don't know how much of that's true or not. It could be true, but we're not going to know because either she or her brother conveniently killed her dad and buried him under the house. So we really can't ask him. She reported her dad missing. She tried some half-assed suicide attempt. She left a note at a downtown building, and I don't remember the details. It's been 20-something years since I researched it, but her dad was with her. So her dad was living with her at her house in New Orleans East that she rented at the time of these murders, or right up to it. And he was a Vietnam veteran, and later she tried to claim that he abused her and that she got PTSD that she inherited from him, which I don't think is a real thing, inheriting PTSD from you. Her dad was in Vietnam 20 years before these murders happened. That's her lawyer's defense. But something happened between the two of them, and she drove to the 7th District Station before these murders. It was a few months before these murders, maybe a month or two at the most. And she reported that he just walked off. She reported him missing. And, you know, cops taking a report and saying, you know, okay, well, what was he wearing and what was he carrying and all this? And she's like, he just walked off in the clothes on his back. And, you know, I hadn't seen him, so I'm worried about him. Well, he's never been seen again by anybody to this day. And after these shootings and these murders, and after her conviction, someone else moved into the house that she was renting in New Orleans East. And that family, they had a dog, and the dog dragged out a human bone from under the house, which appeared to the guy who lived there to be a human. And so they called the cops. Police came out, crime scene, and they dug an entire human skeleton out from under the house. It had been buried in a shallow grave and covered with lime. And I asked somebody once about that. I said, why lime? And the guy told me it's a country thing. Like you bury a dog or anything out in the country, you got to bury yourself. They put lime on it. It speeds up decomposition, supposedly. I'm no chemist, but that's what someone told me. So this human skeleton was under the house in a shallow grave covered with lime, and the police department recovered the skeleton. Now, this is after Antoinette Frank was convicted of murder, and she's sentenced to death row. She's at the women's prison, the only person on death row. And the police department didn't do anything about it. They just let it go. You know, I mean, and my point has always been, you know, when I was researching the book. Now, you know, when I was researching the book, it was 10 years after the murders. So I was researching the book, and my position was, whoever this is has a right to be identified. Exactly. Because somebody is missing this person and doesn't know what happened. And it would be pretty simple. It's, okay, Antoinette reported her father missing. This skeleton, which had a bullet hole in the skull, is under her house. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this might be him.
And you know for a fact it was a human skeleton.
Yes. When I contacted the coroner's office and the district attorney's office while I was researching my book, word had already gone out in New Orleans law enforcement circles not to cooperate with me. And I got that straight from cops I knew. They said, yeah, a memo came out. Don't cooperate with this guy. He's writing a book. It's embarrassing. Obviously, it's embarrassing to the New Orleans Police Department. So either a guy at the coroner's office or a guy at the DA's office, I can't remember. I think it was the coroner's investigator. He tried to convince me that it wasn't a human, that it was actually just a dead dog they found under the house. And I said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, let me check into that. So I contacted Mary Manheim at the Faces Lab at LSU. She's a world-renowned forensic anthropologist. And the Faces Lab has a contract with the New Orleans Police Department for forensic anthropological work, you know, digging up bones, things like that. So she said she couldn't tell me anything about the case. But when I mentioned that the coroner's guy tried to convince me it was a dog, she said, look, I can tell you this. I'm a pretty well-known forensic anthropologist. I don't respond to all the way to New Orleans to a crime scene if it's a dog. Okay, I respond to human remains. So,
there's your confirmation.
That I mean, it's a human.
I just don't understand that. How do you not, as law enforcement, do everything in your power to figure out who these remains belong to?
They have an obligation to do just that, but they didn't, and they still haven't. The bones are still here. They're at LSU. Antoinette's in jail. She has no Fourth Amendment protection. You know, I talked to an assistant DA. I said, you can just go grab her toothbrush. Take her toothbrush, take her hairbrush, whatever she's got, out of her cell. She has no right to it. And do a comparison with the skeleton. Antoinette has living relatives. I think you might need two. There's some kind of cross, thing. I don't know. But you could find out if the skeleton, it's easy. It's a simple procedure to find out if that skeleton is a close relative of Antoinette Frank. And it is. It's her dad. I mean, everybody knows it. I mean, even Rogers Lacaze told me that in his letter. He said, hell, she's so crazy, she killed her own dad. So she must have told him. This is before the body was found. So she must have told him that she killed her dad. The only other possibility is her brother. I can't remember. I think his name is Adam, but he's been convicted of robbery, armed robberies, in and out of prison. He's probably in prison now. And he was also staying with her. So there's a slim possibility, well, I guess probably not slim, probably 50-50 really, whether it was Antoinette or her brother who killed her dad. One of them did it. They were all living there, so.
Has he ever been seen again?
No. Antoinette's father? No, never been seen. I tracked down his ex-wife in Opelousas, which is where Antoinette Frank is from, Opelousas, Louisiana. I keep forgetting you have a vast international audience. Opelousas, Louisiana, and I asked his ex-wife, Antoinette's mother, where's your husband? And she said, oh, he just ran off. She was acting like nothing, no big deal, like he'd been gone for 20 years, but he was coming back soon. They're covering it up. They don't want to admit it. The police department, the DA's office, everybody, they're all covering it up. But, it's a fundamental right of this person to be identified. He's got whoever it is, say it's not her father. Say it's just some random person who got shot in the head and dumped under this house years before Antoinette was even there. Well, that person has relatives. That person is missing. That family deserves some closure on that. And it's a simple DNA test, and you could rule out Antoinette's family immediately and then get cracking into who it really is. But they won't do it because it is Antoinette's dad, and they still hired her as a police officer. And
so it's
they
embarrassing.
They all know she's crazy, and they all know it's embarrassing as hell.
Let me go back to the restaurant. You said that the two people who were killed, they were teenagers. What about their parents?
The parents were not there that night. The parents owned the restaurant, the mother and father, and they left early. I don't remember if both of them were there, or I know the mother was there and she left early. I don't remember if the dad was there that night or he was at home for some reason. But the parents normally ran the restaurant, and they were working earlier, at least one of them, but they left. And Chow Vu was, I believe she was the oldest, and if she wasn't, she had a sister named Ha. It's possible, I may have said they were both teenagers. I think Ha was maybe 20, and the brother Kwong was, I believe, 17 or 18. So you have two brothers and two sisters, or the four kids of the family, and they were running the restaurant that night, and they were going to close up. And, that's so that you have two ran into the convenience store cooler to hide, and two didn't. And those are the two that were killed. Now, what happened, the way the police were called is the boy, the son, who was hiding in the cooler with Chow, he went out the back door and ran to a friend's house. They couldn't use the phone in the restaurant. The phone was a handheld landline, which you don't really see much anymore. But either Antoinette or Rogers took the handset. When Chow snuck up to the front of the restaurant, the dining room, to get to the phone, which is right near where Ronnie Williams was killed and was on the ground, the handset was gone. So there's no way to communicate with anybody. Very few people had cell phones back then. So the boy, Chow's brother, went out the back door and ran to a friend's house. I mean, he ran like a mile, and he got to a friend's house. It's 2 a.m, pounded on the door. Of course, it's going to take a minute before somebody opens the door to you at 2 a.m. in a high crime area. But he eventually called the police. He called 911 and said there were shots fired. So that's how the call went out, and that's why it took so long for the police to get there, and that gave Antoinette time to drop off Rogers, go to there's no scene. Logical reason she went to get a police car. I mean, it makes no sense. They shouldn't have left. They should have just stayed, but I guess they worked themselves up on the drive away of, oh, yeah, there's 2 more. We've got to go back and get them. Rogers probably said, I'm not going, and he took off. I don't know why she got a police car. She wasn't supposed to get a police car. She just basically reached over the counter, grabbed the keys hanging on a pegboard, and took off in one of the police cars.
Did you ever speak to the parents?
No. I spoke to the only one who would talk to me, I guess maybe she was elected as the family spokesperson, was Chow. I interviewed Chow Vu, and I also, they had 2 trials. Antoinette was tried separately from Rogers, and I got the transcripts. So I got a lot of detail of what happened that night from, she testified in both. She was a star witness in both trials. So, Glenn Woods took her through the entire thing. So I got a lot of the detail directly from her testimony at court.
I guess what I'm asking though is like, did she ever specify what this has done for my parents or anything like that?
I mean, she was pretty clear that when I interviewed her that they had not, gotten over it. They're never going to get over it. I mean, it did devastate the whole family. I mean, they kept the restaurant for a while and eventually sold it. And, I don't know what they're doing now. But yeah, it was, it just devastated that family, so it just Antoinette to get some money and maybe to get revenge on a fellow police officer who she felt, didn't give her enough hours working security details, just ruined this family.
It's terrible. Well, Chuck, we appreciate you coming on. For our listeners, the name of the book again is Killer with a Badge. It is available online as well. So ebooks and Kindle, I'm assuming as well. Yep. And it is still available to purchase, though. Correct?
Oh, definitely.
If you're old school, I for some reason I want a book in my hands.
Yeah, there's a paperback version online at normal. Just about every retailer that sells books carries the book and my other books just in case.
Okay, so Killer with a Badge is this specific book. If you like this one, you want to read others. He's got 7 books in total. Chuck, we appreciate you coming on. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
To our listeners, we appreciate you guys. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next episode of Louisiana Unfiltered.